we're really excited to welcome Madeleine Elish, who is the director of the AI on the Ground initiative with the Data and Society Institute, which is based in New York. But we've got her here for the foreseeable future on this coast in the Bay Area, so that's very exciting. And she has a Ph.D. in anthropology from Columbia. That explains the sort of focus on AI on the ground, ethnographic work. I'm an ethnographer, so I think we need more of that. So let me just welcome you up here to give your talk. Thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you to Deirdre. Thank you to the whole sort of AFOG crew for welcoming me. We had a great lunch series this morning, so I'm really, really excited to be here. I have a quick question before we start. So, well, Jenna sort of gave it away. I am an anthropologist. I am an anthropologist, although maybe if you take anthropology here, you do understand. But often when I speak to people and I say I'm an anthropologist, they're rather confused. They say, don't you study sort of, natives in the wild? And I say, well, I mean, kind of. I study how people use technology. I'm curious, because AFOG is an interdisciplinary space, I'm curious to see who is here, actually. So how many people would consider themselves information scientists? Okay. Sociologists? Okay. Anthropologists? All right. Media scholars? Historians? Oh, all right. Absence is the historians in this room. Lawyers or policy researchers? Cool. Artists? I know, I saw you. Anything else that I'm missing that people want to sort of throw into the disciplinary space? Economists. All right, we'll let you in. Just kidding. Okay, and one more question before we get started, just to feel out the room. How many people, or raise your hand if you think AI will surpass human intelligence in 50 years? Raise your hand. All right. 20 years? 10 years? Never? Oh, interesting. So wait, like now I'm in 100 years? All right. Well, I would say generally I'm in the right room because we are, although a lot of you didn't raise your hands, so I'm not sure where people are on this anyways. But I say that because I think all of us are very aware that AI is I don't need to say that we don't need to talk about the robot apocalypse. I don't need to say, but I am saying it, that we need to focus on the here and now. And so that's exactly the kind of research that I do as an anthropologist at Data and Society. And I think also people in this room already probably know that, translating real world problems into technical solutions is often a fraught translation, is often more difficult than it seems. And I think the AFOG group is so exciting, and I'm so glad to be out here now because I think we need to use a multidisciplinary lens to sort of be asking these questions about how do we design, how do we regulate, how do we even investigate these complex algorithmic systems. And so it really is my honor to speak here and to share some of the research that I think speaks to some of these questions that AFOG is interested in. I also just want to throw in this lovely quote from Kurt Vonnegut, Player Piano, which I don't know if you've read it recently, but it's pretty incredible. It says, if it weren't, this is quoting an engineer in this space. I'm on automatic. That's good to know. If it weren't for the people, the goddamn people, said Finnerty, always getting tangled up in the machinery, if it wasn't for them, the world would be an engineer's paradise. So my research, and I think a lot of our concerns, are precisely what happens because there are these, I don't know, can I say that in a, I can say that. There are goddamn people, right? So there you go. So what are we going to do today? We are This is a talk in a couple of sections. I'm going to be talking about research that I have conducted with a series of collaborators over the last several years. I have no conclusions, but I have maybe some framings and some ways forward, and then I look forward to discussion. So first, I want to put out the provocation that autonomous technologies do not exist. I will start with a story, which is that I was, this was several years ago, I was at a self-checkout machine, and I, was actually putting some bananas on the, how do I stop this from not auto? Does anyone know? I know, right? Pause me for a minute. PowerPoint? Just because this is going to keep happening. So. Use timings if present. Advance manually. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. Self-checkout, have the bananas on the scale, and I put them on, and the machine automatically sort of comes up like bananas, 59 cents. And I sort of move on. I'm like, wow, that's actually really, really quite impressive that this self-checkout machine knew that I had bananas. It's sort of incredible machine vision for a dinky little self-checkout, And so I continued on with my groceries. Of course, something went wrong. Something always goes wrong. And I had to ask an attendant to come over and help me. And I sort of mentioned to her, I said, this thing is actually really pretty smart. It knew that I had bananas. And she was like, oh, it didn't know you had bananas. I saw you had bananas. And so I punched it into my machine so that it would automatically show up for you. Here's the thing, I study this for a living, right? I study this for a living, and I attributed much more intelligence to the machine and overlooked the human who was several feet away from me. And so I think that this is a really fundamental truth, and other researchers, really important researchers who have spoken here, talk about this, and yet these standard narratives around tech and tech working autonomously and overestimating the capacities of machines, underestimating the capacities of humans, these are here with us, and in fact they even infected my own common sense. Because in fact, if we look at the history of automation, and we look at several kinds of histories of technology, we see that new technologies rarely do away with the human or human drudgery as they may promise, but rather these introductions find new ways to obscure the humans and the human labor that makes this technology possible. And so, in fact, we found this very much to be the case in research that I'll tell you about called AI in Context, which was joint work with Alexandra Matiscu. And this report looked at two industries which are broadly positioned by the media and by the sort of various tech industry as being on the precipice of being transformed by AI, specifically agriculture and retail. In fact, the banana story is what sort of occasioned the sort of was an originating moment of this research project. And so we did about 20 interviews and some background research, and we came to the unsurprising conclusion that none of the technology actually works the way people think it does. And in the context of agriculture, we found several ways in which the farmers were acquiring and exercising important skills that were really prerequisites for the technology to work as intended. For instance, they were putting in new kinds of physical infrastructures to be sure that the indeed precision agricultural technologies that they were using could even work. They were often really changing their work routines. They were changing their physical infrastructure. They were also changing sort of local cultures about what it meant to be a farmer. It also required different ways of thinking about the sort of work of farming. And really, for instance, a physical field now had to be conceptualized as a complex data set to be managed, rather than a field that sort of required the farmers to get out into the fields and be looking at the soil. And what's really interesting in the case of precision agriculture is that there's a whole dominant narrative around how the future of agriculture is AI. We're in a climate crisis. The only way forward is with AI-driven ag solutions, which is probably likely in the long term. But how is that going to happen, and who is it going to affect in the immediate term? We really found that these sort of media narratives were too quickly glossing over the kind of labor and even physical conditions that were required in order for this technology to actually work as it was intended. And this led us to an interesting sort of framing around the difference between integrating a technology and deploying a technology. So I had sort of up to this point always used the term deploy, right? Deploy this, deploy that. But actually, if you think about it, deploy is a military term. It's often used in the context of military action, and it really connotes a kind of contextless, like dropping in. If you think about, and to deploy puts the focus of what you're doing on the technology itself. You are deploying the technology. Contrast that with what we were seeing farmers trying to do, or actually often farmers not doing, because that's another sort of set of research issues that I won't go into, but what we saw farmers not doing was integrating these technologies. And rather than deploy, integrate actually requires you to say, integrate into what or with whom. It really requires a kind of rhetorical framing of where this technology is going, who and what are the existing sort of practices and norms that are there. And what it means to integrate a technology into different social contexts will have different kinds of implications. Because in fact, while our AI in Context report looked at retail jobs and agriculture, we found a lot of really important differences, particularly around the kind of power dynamics involved of farmers integrating technology into their existing work practices and retail workers essentially having this technology integrated sort of into them and with them. And so, you know, while self-checkout, you might say it's not AI. Why are you looking at it? I think it's worth visiting because both self-checkout is often positioned as being kind of on a lineage to full automation. And also because it picks up on this important dynamic about the ways in which, again, labor will not necessarily be displaced, or replaced, but it will be reconfigured. And so what are the implications of that reconfiguring? And what we in fact see is that self-checkout is a good example of defining what does the success of integrating a technology look like and for whom. So for instance, we looked at the ways in which self-checkout technologies often fail, actually. And the retail workers that we ended up speaking to really actually described how they acted as sort of smoothing over the rough edges of this technology, which really wasn't sort of working as intended. There was a lot of invisible labor that they were doing that was compensating for the shortcomings of these technologies in really creative ways, whether it was, adding in that I had bananas quickly so that the line could move faster, or whether it was because they were actually like repairing the machines themselves, which break down, but management had never sort of accounted for how that those forms of maintenance would be required. And so these technologies were in some ways maybe benefiting the retailers, but in many ways were leading to a disempowered situation for the retail workers. So both of these instances, I think, call out this need to think about deploying versus integrating and what comes into focus when we shift our thinking like this. So another shift in focus that I want to offer in the next section has to do with what happens when we, so in the first section, I've sort of said, hey, look, there are all these often invisible but very necessary humans who are around. Autonomous technologies do not exist. The next section sort of says, okay, and what are the consequences in a particular instance of sort of overlooking the consequential roles that humans are playing? So to do this, I want to step back in time for a minute and take you back to a couple of years ago. This is collaborative work with Tim Huang. Tim and I were thinking about driverless cars. And we wanted to know, what could we learn about the future of responsibility in autonomous systems by looking at the adoption of proto-autonomous systems like cruise control or aviation autopilot in the past? And so specifically, we looked at the history of litigation, court cases around autopilot since around the 1950s, when commercial aviation really became commonplace. We looked at court cases, we looked at official government accident reports. We also looked at news coverage. We looked at all of these different, from all these different perspectives about what was happening when there were accidents involving aviation autopilot, and we began to notice a counterintuitive pattern. We found that while conceptions of legal liability, we found that conceptions of legal liability were not adequately keeping pace with the ways in which the technologies were advancing. There were mismatches between control, for instance, in this case, control over how flight was occurring, which had been increasingly shifted to automated systems. There were mismatches between this control over the flight and the responsibility for that flight, which was remaining solely focused on the pilot. In other words, while physical control of the system was distributed in time and space through the machine to the engineers and the designers of that autopilot, responsibility was not. It was remaining firmly on the body of the pilot. We thought this was a really important pattern, and so we wanted to call attention to it, and we gave it a name, a moral crumple zone. So just as the crumple zone in a car is designed to absorb the force of impact in a crash, the human in a highly complex and automated system may become simply a component, likely accidentally or intentionally, that bears the brunt of the moral and legal responsibilities when the overall system malfunctions. The metaphor of the moral crumple zone for us wasn't just a way to talk about a scapegoat. It was really meant to call attention to the ways in which automated and autonomous systems are going to deflect responsibility in unique and systematic ways. And while the crumple zone in a car is meant to protect the human driver, the moral crumple zone protects the integrity of the technological system itself. So for instance, one example that we examined in detail had to do with the famous Airbus Air France crash in 2009, which was very, very famous and well known at the time. And the accident was initially blamed on pilot error. But in fact, the cause of the accident, as in fact the sociology of accidents tells us, was much more complex. It involved actually mechanical failures as well as systemic oversights. And there was human errors, but those human errors were actually later described as likely being caused by the automation itself. In fact, the researcher Lynn Brainbridge has called this one of the ironies of automation. That is that automation promises to eliminate human error, but actually it creates opportunities for new kinds of errors. So just to briefly illustrate this, the accident occurred when the Airbus had flown into a storm. Ice crystals had formed on the plane's pitot tubes, which are a part of the avionics systems that measures airspeed. And the frozen pitot tubes sent faulty data back to the pilot, back to the autopilot, sorry. Right, so the sensors on the pitot tubes are speaking to the autopilot, and the autopilot did what it was designed to do in the absence of data. The autopilot disengaged and bounced control of the aircraft back to the pilots. The autopilot knew that the data coming from the sensors was impossible. And so it said, oh, I have bad data, and sent it back to the pilots. However, caught by surprise, the pilots were sort of overwhelmed by an influx of loud warning signals, confusing instrument readings, and this problem called the handoff problem, which has been shown for decades in human factors research to be a really hard problem to solve, which is that humans are very bad at taking over in high information, high stress environments. So this sort of huge complex system of problems ended up leaving in the words of the official French report that the pilots had lost cognitive control of the situation. A series of errors and incorrect maneuvers by the pilots ended in the planes crashing into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 228 people on board. They had to take charge of the aircraft under conditions of weather and altitude that modern pilots rarely experience. This is in part because the autopilot is always in control. So this also leads to this idea of automation paradox, and this idea that, in fact, as pilots fly less and supervise automated systems more, their basic skills can atrophy. And in fact, many studies have shown that pilot awareness generally decreases with increased automation. But part of the problem is that the cultural perceptions of automation are also playing into this. And again, we as a culture tend to overestimate the intelligence of machines and underestimate the capacities of humans. So let me just give you a clear example, which is that in an ad for the predecessor of the Airbus 320, the predecessor of the plane that crashed, the A320, which was unveiled in 1986, an aviation expert was quoted as saying that the plane's all-new fly-by-wire system, its sort of complete automation, would be, quote, smart enough to protect the airplane and the people aboard it from any dumb moves by the pilot. But in fact, in the case of Air France 447, automation, it seems, really contributed to those dumb moves. So the circumstances surrounding this accident, and in a paper that we wrote, we look at other examples. We're trying to demonstrate how accountability for an accident, for a failure, is sort of being deflected off of the automated and intelligent parts of a system, and being focused on the immediate human operators who have limited control and even limited sort of access and capacity to act. So it's really interesting, and when we think about this in the context of what does it mean then to have a human in the loop, right? Because we think about human in the loop as being a pretty good answer to thinking about some of the problems of automation. After all, it's meant to theoretically ensure that human judgment can trump automation at any moment. But as we've seen in the context of aviation, it often means that the human is taking on a responsibility disproportionate to the amount of real time that they actually have. And in fact, we saw this in real time. So I assume most of you remember that on March 18, 2018, a self-driving Uber car struck and killed a pedestrian crossing her bike in the middle of an Arizona roadway. It was the first reported pedestrian fatality involving a driverless car, and it garnered a lot of immediate attention, and rightly so. At the steering wheel of the putative autonomous vehicle, a safety driver sat, and her job was to monitor the car's systems and take over in the event of an emergency, very much like our pilot. So it's notable that the safety driver is now facing criminal charges of vehicular manslaughter, but Uber itself has been cleared of any wrongdoing. So a devastating accident really forced this question that previously had only been hypothetical. And in fact, unfortunately, the sort of dynamics that Tim and I had identified actually played out. So many of you may not have been noticing that the storylines in the hours following the accident really quickly shifted from being deadly this is an example, deadly crash with self-driving Uber, to in fact focusing on the safety driver. So this quote is from one of the local investigative teams. I suspect preliminarily it appears to me that Uber would likely not be at fault in this accident. I won't rule out the potential to file charges against the backup driver of the Uber vehicle. And so very unfortunately, all of this responsibility for what was in fact a complex socio-technical system in which, yes, the driver may indeed bear some responsibility, but we also, I think, need to keep in mind the context of decades of aviation, of human factors research that tells us that the handoff problem is a really hard problem that actually we're really bad at solving. So actually, what kind of role is the safety driver really? And is that a safe role? Is the safety driver really in a full, being positioned well to even have the control and responsibility that is being placed upon them? So I would very much say that the safety driver here was caught in the moral crumple zone. And so to loop it back to this idea of human in the loop design principles may unfortunately become a way not for humans to retain control, but really a way to kind of become actually like a liability or a responsibility sponge, sort of soaking up all of the sort of responsibility that our sort of strong belief in the autonomy and sort of capacities of machines deflect off of themselves. So, I hope that the moral crumple zone, as with the idea of deploying versus integrating, helps us ask better questions of what is happening around us and thinking about how, in the case of moral crumple zones, how particular harms are arising, which are in fact not recognized as harms by our existing forms of responsibility or even sort of legal conceptions of harms. Really because in part, most of our regulations and certifications think about systems as technologies and not as socio-technical systems. So, yes, it's been a bit, I've painted a bleak picture, I would say. And so I'm excited to present the next and sort of final piece of this information, or of this talk, which is that I think that part of doing this research isn't just about helping us reframe what's happening around us, finding ways to identify new forms of harm which maybe aren't legible in our existing frameworks, but also thinking about how we can change the way technologies are designed and even the way that they're conceptualized when they're actually before they've actually been built. And so while I see part of my work as articulating these new forms of risk and harm, I also see my role as an interdisciplinary researcher, working in interdisciplinary spaces, not just to critique, but also to collaborate on creating alternative futures. And so that's why the project that I'm going to tell you about next is really very exciting. For the last couple of years, I've been part of an interdisciplinary team at Duke University, and the Duke Institute for Health Innovation, which has been working on a project called Sepsis Watch, which is a deep learning tool that is being used to help predict the risk of a patient developing sepsis in the emergency department of the Duke medical system. The collaboration with the team really stemmed from their realization that there were going to be important social dimensions of the clinical context that they knew they were not necessarily well equipped to understand. They actually had, without having the specific language of a socio-technical system, they understood that Sepsis Watch was going to be socio-technical. Let me back up for a moment. What is sepsis? What is Sepsis Watch? So sepsis is essentially when your body, when fighting an infection, goes into overdrive. And sometimes it's described as an infection of the blood, but really what it means is that your immune system starts attacking itself and starts attacking the body. And it can lead to organ failure and death if not treated in time. Really, anyone can get sepsis. It stems from an existing infection. And in fact, while the sort of more immunocompromised are, of course, more likely to develop sepsis, anywhere from getting surgery on your knee to postpartum recovery can be a candidate for developing sepsis. And in fact, it's a huge problem, not just in the American medical system, but actually globally. The World Health Organization has identified it as being a priority for interventions. And what is Sepsis Watch? So it's actually pretty complicated to describe the workflow, and so I'm not going to go into it fully, but I will say that basically when a patient enters, or when a person arrives at the emergency department of Duke, and they are checked in, the data on their electronic health record is sent to the Sepsis Watch program, at which point a deep learning model processes that information. There's if you're interested in learning more about the project, I really recommend that you go and look at several of the articles that have been published, both about the model as well as most recently other aspects of the project. And the deep learning model takes the data and then outputs a risk score for how likely a patient is to develop sepsis. That risk score is communicated to a nurse whose job it is to monitor that screen, actually, and to call the emergency physician who is treating the patient, call the emergency physician if the risk score is high enough such that the physician should be alerted as to the patient's status. So the core and ostensibly the most unique component of Sepsis Watch is that it involves a deep learning model that can predict risk. There's actually a significant part of the model that also is about being sure that once a patient has been diagnosed as at high risk for sepsis and then as septic, that the care and the existing sort of best practices and protocols for treating sepsis are fully carried out. So it's both a program that is intended to predict the risk of sepsis and then to ensure that there is full and effective care. And so this form of AI, this sort of deep learning model that predicts the risk, actually stands in for Sepsis Watch as the whole. But actually, Sepsis Watch is made up of a set of both other kinds of technical infrastructures that don't involve machine learning, and institutional infrastructures, of course, all of the data that already exists in the electronic health records, but then also it is a socio-technical system that is also necessarily combined or constituted through human labor and human expertise. And so when my sort of part of the research project was focused on identifying the implications of integrating Sepsis Watch into the emergency department for doctors and nurses and sort of their modes of communication and flows of information and relationships, and basically the sort of complex coordination of clinicians that is required to ensure patient care in a hospital setting. Again, I had a great time talking about this research with the APOG group this morning. This is research in progress, and so thanks for listening and also for sort of not hearing all of the details. You'll be able to read them elsewhere soon. But so what I wanted to share in the context of this talk is to really share one of our most important findings, I think, and then to say why this finding matters. As I said, the process of building Sepsis Watch from the team's perspective really was looked at as a process of integration and not deployment. And from the beginning, the developers were very aware of the need to kind of include stakeholders, be sure that local data and model development were tightly coupled, and they knew that it wasn't going to be the technology that solved this problem of treating sepsis, but that it was going to be, in part, the kind of nurses, in fact, and doctors who would use Sepsis Watch as a tool. But when we began to really look at what that looked like on the floor, we saw that there was a lot of work that was actually unanticipated that the nurses were doing to integrate the output, the risk score that the tool was producing into existing clinical routines. So, for instance, it was disrupting like existing ways that doctors and nurses were communicating. It was actually also disrupting the ways in which not only sepsis had been cared for before, but also the ways in which power relations operated in the emergency department, in the ways that doctors and nurses were accustomed to sort of interacting with each other. Because in this case, nurses were communicating to the doctors around informing them about a process of diagnosis, which really was like not the way the hospital works. And we began to characterize this dynamic as one of breakage and repair. So digital technologies are, in fact, often described by innovators and the media as disruptive. Innovations are good because they disrupt, right? They disrupt outdated ways of doing things and thinking about problems. Disruption shakes things up. And while it can create new forms of opportunity, it can also destabilize existing forms of protection for workers and even for consumers. And in fact, disruptions in a high-stake workplace like a hospital can lead to confusion and chaos and even, subpar performance. But in fact, the introduction of Sepsis Watch has been really quite successful. And we identified the work of the nurses as allowing this success to occur. Because in fact, they were repairing the breakages that had been sort of set in motion by Sepsis Watch, right? So Sepsis Watch was actually designed to disrupt the old way of doing things, in which patients were not receiving adequate care for Sepsis Watch or for sepsis, right? But again, along with the disruption that was going to be beneficial in the intervention, also came a disruption to power relations, organizational hierarchies, even rhythms of daily practice. And so the analogy of repair allows us to really highlight this work that the nurses were doing as essential, that their labor enabled the intervention and the tool to work as it was intended, and without this labor, it would not work. And so for me, our focus on this sort of consequential and constituent labor that is required to integrate this AI tool into workflows is is really important if we need to understand how to develop effective AI-driven solutions. The surfacing of this layer is a means to think productively also about the future of work and about how the dignity of humans who are working alongside AI systems might be enhanced rather than diminished. So for instance, when the nurses are recognized as playing this quintessential repair role in the context of Sepsis Watch, how can they get accolades for doing that? How can they be recognized as the professional experts that they are in ways that really make visible and value that work? So, by way of conclusion, because again, I have no real conclusions, but whether it's through framing problems as ones of integration versus deployment, whether it's through accidentally creating moral crumple zones, or understanding that innovation is disruption and is going to require repair. The research in this talk underscores the importance of understanding questions of technology and those of accountability and fairness and bias as ones not just of a technology or of a machine learning algorithm, but really of a socio-technical system. And I think to take a socio-technical look, and I'd be interested actually to have a discussion about this phrase of the socio-technical. We were talking about this earlier, but for us, looking at a problem as socio-technical really is a way to call attention to a variety of influences and settings and histories and ways of thinking about power dynamics and legacies of how a technology was developed that underpins the vast network of people and objects and institutions that any intervention, any AI-driven system is going to be invoking when it works in the world. AI and machine learning technologies are often more and more being looked at as the key to solving every sort of most pressing problem facing us. And you know, this happens in the pages of the media as well as in institutional structures like X Prize, right? Which has competitions to sort of have the most amazing technology to solve the world's greatest problems. But rarely are these solutions tested or verified or even used in the wild, let alone really conceptualized as a socio-technical system. And so, in fact, I like to end on the Sepsis Watch research because I really do think that a lot of AI technologies hold great promise to address problems, right? But they're only going to be part of the solution, and they're going to be part of larger systems that have to take into account, that have to be integrated into the existing social worlds that they'll be operating in. And to not do this accounting will risk failure at best and harmful consequences at worst, such as the crashes, the aviation crashes and automobile crashes that I talked about. So for existing problems, we should be thinking we should rather be focusing on how and in what ways technology could be integrated into existing social processes such that they could actually be helpful in addressing those problems. Thank you. I saw your hand first.
Hi, I was wondering what your thoughts are about, you mentioned this piece on how can we make sure that the expertise that is being unacknowledged and unappreciated and uncompensated in many ways, how we can build towards that. And I'm wondering whether you've seen any patterns in the ways that, whether it's along gender or race or class lines, of the ways that users of automated systems are constantly kind of demoted in certain ways, and in other ways they're not. They're kind of like promoted. So pilots, for example, that really didn't affect it because maybe it has to do with the fact that it has kind of traditionally been a male-dominated career. And in the cases of nurses, they've always had to fight, right, to be acknowledged in the fight with expertise with doctors in that entire ecosystem. So if you've seen maybe any trends, if you could speak to that, or whether you're just seeing a lot of reinforcement patterns.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and I would just point you to the work of Julia Ticona, who is a sociologist, who has looked at even the ways in which different the sort of intersectional positionalities of different types of workers and how they're allowed to use their mobile phones at work plays out, and with what consequences, right? So lower status workers are going to not be allowed to look at their phones, but higher status workers, it actually is a form of status to show that you are always on your phone, right? So these kinds of racial and class dynamics absolutely play out in every introduction of technology. I think what's interesting is when things sort of is when an introduction shakes up those norms in unexpected ways. So actually, several other studies that have looked at the use generally of automated scoring systems in healthcare have shown that when nurses are often the sort of like receivers and like managers of this data, which is of course interesting in and of itself. But some studies have shown that it actually empowers nurses to do their work better or to sort of more easily make claims about their expertise because it's quantified, right? So before, if they said, this patient looking really bad, on the whole, right, like hopefully doctors and nurses were moving toward a better place where there's more, but it depends on the hospital. Nurses become equipped with a particular type, like a number, right? And then they are able to exercise the kind of expertise that has been conferred upon that number. So it's interesting in how the nurse maybe emerges as a more powerful agent, but then also keeping in mind that it is actually the sort of ascription of power to the number itself, which is sort of motivating that. So it's a good question. I think it's important work to sort of look at all of the different dynamics. We definitely saw that in the difference between farmers, who again were sort of who is in the position to say whether they are allowed to adopt a technology or not, is also a sign of power that is going to have implications for sort of the nested set of complications that will ensue.
So my work focuses on the role that workers have in having a voice or not in these very processes that you're describing of integrating technology. So I'm curious if, particularly with Sepsis Watch, if you observed anything about the role of the nurses' unions, or I see you talk to UFCW, and like helping the workers to have a voice over how these technologies are used. Because I'm thinking in particular of here in California, the nurses' union very vocally opposed the use of these personalized care algorithms. And so it seems to be sort of a contrast with Sepsis Watch.
So in my research, it's actually interesting. I don't recall anyone mentioning anything about the nursing union. In terms of how the nurses were involved in the development of Sepsis Watch, this was a very small team, and I think in part what made the project exciting and sort of an example of responsible innovation was that it was really closely tailored to the local context and was just constantly in feedback loops with the nurses, which meant sort of as soon as the model was sort of completed, like thinking about how they were developing the application itself, doing prototypes, doing meetings, doing forms of education and outreach. What I think is an important lesson from that is that there were resources, financial resources required to establish these forms of engagement. And so there was, I think it's often easy to sort of say, like, let's involve worker voices. Absolutely important, and even more important, is being sure that there are resources to facilitate that engagement, and also to ensure there are ways that that engagement can be productive. The director of our labor futures group at Data and Society is named Aiha Nguyen, and she's been working a lot with actually precisely like how can the data that is gathered about workers be used as, whether it's in like negotiations or just sort of that there's a role of educating workers around what is actually taking place, but then having them educate researchers about what's going on as well.
Thanks so much for your talk. It's just so rich and refreshing, like this material. And I really appreciate that you always like take this step back and talk about framing, which I think is like really important, how we look at things and how we are like cultured to look at things. And, you know, my conjecture is part of the thing that like contributes to this whole situation we're in right now is that it's in like deploying or even integrating technologies is sometimes used as signaling like coolness or being innovative or being like on top of things, you know, being cutting edge and all of this. And admitting that you're using people within your systems is like almost sometimes seen as like shameful, or like that means your system isn't perfect or it's like failing, something like this. So like there is a lot of, you know, this stigmatization in a way around like using humans in the loop. Have you seen any research on this? Like, is this, you know, how like anecdotal is this? Like, have you thought about it? Like, basically, what do we do with this? And like, how real is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you are definitely articulating an important trend in the research, and one that I've seen shift in my sort of time working on these issues. I think I feel like there was a shift a couple of years ago where people stopped, where people began to talk about the sort of effectiveness of collaboration and human team cooperation, or human sort of robot teams, and the sort of productive collaborations that, you know, a human and a chess playing algorithm actually outperform either a human or a chess playing algorithm. But I think you're right that there is a huge piece of marketing that's around this. And it is, unfortunately, it seems not cool to have humans. And I don't really know what the answer to that is. There's an area of like business research, maybe you know more about this, this kind of the idea of the high road, that there are some businesses who, as a competitive strategy, as well as, you know, a belief in like the beneficial economics, that investing in workers does result, investing in the humans that make your processes work does have better outcomes, and this field of research about the high road talks about that. It's a tough question though, and I don't know the answer. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this talk. It was incredibly informative. Given your work with Sepsis Watch, it seems like a really great way of using AI to assess risk. And it seems like there have been other places where similar risk assessment tools have been almost criticized. For instance, pre-trial cases where courts can use risk assessment tools to determine possible risk of recidivism. And so I'm curious to get your insight on how possibly risk assessment tools could be used to almost stratify inequality, and maybe how the different uses of technology can be either lead to different effects or perceptions depending on the institutional setting that they're used within.
Huge question, actually, right? Like, where should we use AI systems and where should we not? I think it's important that there be an answer to that question. That is, sometimes we shouldn't, right? Sometimes systems are too dysfunctional, too broken, that any sort of automation of any piece of that will result in harms, right? So I think there are probably important cases to be made about that in the context of the American criminal justice system. On the other hand, the idea that it is very compelling to think about, if we can have a slightly better solution, or if there is an intervention that AI could improve to some degree, do we want to have, do we want to take the slightly better, and what is worth sort of upholding an already broken system? And that is just beyond the context of my research to assess in lots of contexts. I mean, certainly in the case of driverless cars, actually, I love my driver-assisted Subaru, actually. I think that driver assist will, like, the technologies that underpin a lot of autonomous driving will make the roads safer. But that sort of can't be the end of the story, and we need to sort of say, like, the sort of how AI systems will make driving safer are not sort of blanketly true, right? We need to think about what is the teaming, how is driver assist going to support me as a driver and not set me up to be a moral crumple zone such that I'm like monitoring something that's really out of my control, and then I'm going to be poorly able to jump in at the last minute. And so I think in the case of Sepsis Watch, and we talk about this in a paper that we published on this research for the FATSTAR, the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning conference that happened 2 months ago. We talk about some of the sort of aspects of development that allowed this technology to be developed responsibly. And so I think really figuring out like the local contexts, stakeholder involvement, problem formulation is really important. There's like an amazing set of resources that after a long day, I'm not gonna be able to sort of flow off the top of my head. But I think it's also like the $1 million question, and we need more specific studies of technologies in practice so we can see where the sort of unintended consequences are, where the tensions emerge in ways that we didn't expect.
Take the privilege of having the microphone and sneak in a follow-up question that's related to this. I'm wondering if fairness ever came up with Sepsis Watch, and I'm thinking of that recent study where they were looking at patients who were at high risk of like using a lot of hospital resources and trying to intervene early to get them preventative care, and they found it was very biased by race. So white patients were targeted as high risk who had the same level of sickness as Black patients. And so even in this context, we're not talking about criminal justice, but we're still talking potentially about fairness issues. I'm just curious if that ever came up at all in all the discussions about integrating it.
Yeah, so I think the team felt that having the data, and I would sort of limit what I can say because I would like the technical team to speak more to this. But what I can say is that they felt that the way that they were tailoring the existing data of who was getting care for sepsis and who wasn't, was tailored to the local population, and that they trusted their data, because whether someone receives a diagnosis of sepsis or not, it didn't matter sort of when it occurred, but the training data was like, did a person develop sepsis? Did they receive treatment in time? Was the full course of treatment like done? And they felt certain that the way that they had sort of used their existing local data, that they were not going to be amplifying any existing biases. I think, or introducing new biases. And I think the question of if there were disparities in healthcare that their hospitals already looking at, were there ways that Sepsis Watch should be taking those into account, is something that I think the team thinks about for future work. I think that they were very new to the sort of space of like the large set of concerns they were both aware of the concerns, but also think about this as a long research agenda. I think certainly, the fact that Obermeyer's et al., who's here at Berkeley, their piece, also research by Khadija Ferryman and Michaela Pitcairn, have shown that precision medicine generally really is problematic, and it's going to be introducing new kinds of errors. But I think there was an aggregacy of the data that was at stake in a way that, like in the case of Sepsis Watch, there wasn't.
So first of all, thanks. Your wonderful talk, and your work is really important, and appreciate it. So part of the problem with automated cars and the way we conceptualize these complex technologies is we think the right thing to do is just plop them into complex systems. So if you take something like automated cars, actually the best use of automated cars would be to design dedicated roadways just for automated cars, and then you wouldn't have to worry so much about what happens at pedestrian crosswalks. So when you take do we do enough, or how do you think about the problem of preparing contexts for machine learning rather than creating machine learning, dropping it into context and hoping that the humans make the adjustments necessary to use it? Shouldn't we think ahead of time about how to actually alter the workplace or prepare the workplace in a different way, rather than depending so much on the adaptability of human beings, like the nurses in this particular case? And then the corollary question to that is, nurses are highly competent, educated professionals. When we begin dropping AI into normal, quote unquote, contexts of everyday life where people aren't trained and probably aren't willing to put in the time to make those kinds of adaptations, aren't we just asking for even greater trouble, because we'll have more negative outcomes simply because people aren't willing to put in that effort that the nurses put in to try to fix, repair the brokenness of the system?
I take your point. It's a very important one. I think what does give me pause about that perspective is that it assumes that the best use of limited resources is to remake the world in a way that is oriented around machines. And so I think that, again, it's going to matter sort of which context it is in, and what the sort of trade-offs are. But in the case of driverless cars, like, wouldn't it be great if we could just build really effective public transport for cities so people didn't need individual cars? So I think there is a temptation to say, well, let's just like put in all the infrastructure so that the technology can work better. But we live in a world of limited resources. And so I think this is something that we get into in the Sepsis Watch case, is like, technology is an occasion for investment. that's just like an observation of the world. Governments give out grants for new technologies for schools, right? Or for roads or for whatever. But I think we have to think carefully about if that allocation of resources is solving a problem, or is it just allowing more technology to be bought?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm really interested in this handoff process. With the driverless cars and with the airplane, we talked about how high stress situations is really hard for humans to then take over in those situations. But at the hospital, while one could assume being in a hospital alone would be a high stress situation, like what did you notice about the handoff process in that context?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been really fun to make this talk. I've never done a talk this long that combined all three of these. And so it's really interesting to be seeing the kind of resonances and then to hear the questions. It's very interesting. So one of the ways in which we saw the nurses doing repair work was precisely to mitigate like the suddenness of the sort of handoff of information. We saw them sort of figuring out when the right time to call a doctor was, sort of having strategies around when they would call, how they would sort of organize their, how they would like organize the information that they were conveying such that they would facilitate that sort of information handoff. We also saw a lot of emotional labor that was being performed by the nurses. Sort of, there's a great quote from one of our interviewees who sort of says, like, I always get on the phone and I say, "Hi, this is so and so from Sepsis Watch. How are you doing today?" And even though she knew that it was really annoying to the person to have to sort of answer, it might have been annoying for the doctor to have to answer, like, how are you doing? It was a way for her to gauge the mood of the doctor, right? And so if, like, the doctor said, great, how are you? Then she would be prepared for one kind of conversation. And if the doctor said, then it's another kind of conversation. So I want to think more about like the nature of the handoff, but I think what I can say is that was part of the repair work that the nurses were doing, was sort of easing that transition, making it a more doable handoff.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask if, especially, first you were talking about the farmers having to basically implement all this infrastructure, change the way that they did farming, and then in the Sepsis Watch, there was, an introduction of a new technology plus a change in basically communication and workflow. And I was wondering if you could speak to what triggered the sort of institutional recognition of that sort of hidden labor, and the investment that it took in order to, allocate, an RN for basically watching this algorithm, and then the investment from the emergency department to actually change this workflow.
So this project, and again, you can see the details in several papers. Mark Sendek is my main collaborator in this, and he and his team at DHI, the Duke Institute for Health Innovation, have a really interesting way in which they are situated in a unique part of Duke where they do some basic research, do also some applied research, and do a lot of projects with clinicians and professors at Duke. And this project stemmed from a proposal that two clinicians put together because they wanted to develop this project. They wanted to find a way to better to better identify patients who were at risk for sepsis and then ensure that treatment was followed through. It was part of a longer process that actually had already existed in the institution previously to improve care, right? Hospitals are constantly sort of looking at their numbers, their metrics, seeing like where they're failing patients, where they're not. And so, again, one of the unique and I think sort of defining aspects of the project was that it was a problem that came from clinicians, and it was a problem that several members of the team had already worked on that problem, but in another project. Like they had a sort of historical knowledge of trying to deal with that problem in the past, and that shaped their approaches. And so where the problem came from was that it was an existing problem. It really like wasn't a technology in search of a solution, which often interventions are.
Hi, thank you. I was really interested in the moment, especially since you were talking about data, how the information was passed from like data form to the nurse who then called. Was it just a number on a screen? What was that handoff like?
So these are prototypes. This is not what it looks like entirely, but these are different screens that show. I think that this is also what the iPad application looks like. The different colored cards represent different. That's what these are called, cards. Represent patients. All the PAI data has been scrubbed on this. This is from a forthcoming publication, so I'm actually not going to hang out on it, but I'm going to come back. Just because it's Mark et al.'s publication, so I don't want to sort of steal their thunder yet. But to give you a sense of, it's an iPad, and the UI looks sort of like that. It looks like an iPad application that, you know, it has like a really modern look to it. It operates outside of their electronic health record system. So it pulls data, but the iPad itself is like distinct from the computer terminal where they're doing a lot of their sort of EHR work. What else can I, that sort of, yeah. So it's like the risk score is a number, but it's represented in colors. And then there's also contextualizing data about the patient that accompanies the risk score. So it also isn't like, 24. Like it's, just like black and white on an iPad. It's presented in a way that the nurses can kind of go in and contextualize, can sort of see who the patient is, at least in terms of how the patient is represented through numbers.
Thanks again for a fantastic talk. I'm curious how much or if conversations about long-term monitoring and evaluation of Sepsis Watch came up. So imagining both or either or some sort of randomized control trial maybe, but also, and kind of even more, the idea of long-term monitoring of how the system is performing, especially as, new types of alerts might come up, increasing the cognitive load. So just wondering like how those conversations came up and if there were any sort of best practices or solutions you guys thought about.
Yeah, so the development team has a phrase that they like to repeat called "you make it, you own it," and they felt very strongly. So there were several types of ongoing monitoring and maintenance processes that they put into place after the tool was first implemented. Some of these involved a governance committee that was actually composed of different stakeholders from around the hospital, including frontline clinicians, including the nurses, to kind of deal with new problems as they came up, but in a sort of regular meeting. So there was the governance committee that kind of dealt with the hospital issues that would come up, and then it was sort of in a way owned by the hospitals, the clinicians and administrators, but then there was still a technical piece that DHI feels very responsible for. They actually have a monitor in their office which shows the data real time. Because there was one point at which the tool, a weird like data pipeline bug, ended up really screwing with the model, and it was just like some crazy stuff happening. And they only found out about it because someone at the hospital, or no, I think what they were originally looking at it on like a web portal. And they realized that they needed to have the monitor set up in their office, like front and center. So they're very aware and trying to figure out ways to make it sustainable, but with an awareness that it's ongoing.
Hi, I have a question about the legal parts that you touched on the Uber case. Do you think that the legal framework is evolving to catch up with kind of lack of managerial responsibility? Why I'm asking about that one is because Uber knew exactly why they went to Arizona. First, there is no regulation, and it was common knowledge that there are no pedestrians. So the system wasn't designed to actually recognize any pedestrian. So it was by design set up for failure in that scenario. So why is the legal system associating the failure with that safety driver and not the CEO of Uber that approves that decision? So ignorance kind of pays off.
So
all levels here.
The system was designed to avoid obstacles, including. I don't think that I can't say with certainty, but I would have a hard time believing that it was not designed to, in some ways, track pedestrians. The problem was that the system didn't recognize the woman, Elaine Hertzberg, as a pedestrian. It recognized what it sort of processed was. Actually, it had a really hard time processing what it was. It wasn't sure if it was a person, was it a bicycle, was it like a stationary thing? So it was a failure on the part of the sensors, but I think the system is designed to avoid obstacles and to not hurt anyone. I think the question of Arizona and how do sort of the regulations of testing and experimentation affect where and how technologies are developed is very interesting. Some states like Arizona, of course, do have much more of a sort of laissez-faire attitude toward regulation. They want to bring a lot of that industry. They sort of see the trade-off as like trusting the companies because they want to also have those companies testing in their areas and bring those jobs to their state. It's interesting if we change the terminology though, and we say they're experiments as opposed to tests. And I think there is a lawsuit which I understand I'm not sure if it has sort of stalled out, but there was a family member who was suing I believe it was the governor of Arizona, or maybe it was the mayor of the city for allowing such testing to occur without adequately knowing about all of the risks. So I think it is an interesting sort of tactic on how do we think about the costs of doing these experiments in public places, and when we think about them as tests or when we think about them as experiments, and who sort of gets a say in whether they're being experimented on or not.
Okay. Just to follow up, there's an interesting paper on, they call it agency laundering by Rubel from I think Madison, but they talk about it as a moral wrong, as you're laundering your agency, like Uber is trying to like, oh, it's the algorithm, it's this incomprehensible algorithm, you know, like trying to smear out the responsibility across this complicated system.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a great paper called, it's about agency laundering.
I like that term.
Forgive me if this is too like. I had a question about we talked about it before a little bit about the regulatory pathway that the team in the Sepsis Watch chose to follow, and I just wondering if you were privy to any of those discussions, because I used to work in medical devices, and we'd spend months debating like what kind of device is this? Is it class 1, class 2, class 3? What is the intended use? And all the benefits and disadvantages of calling it a device or not. It's a device. Does it make, what kind of decisions does it make? And then the different levels of rigor that you have to demonstrate. You know, if you say this is a class 3 device, it's this very long process, and there's a lot of human factors work that has to go into it. And I was wondering if, anyway, I was just curious if you got to sit in on any meetings where they discussed like, what's our regulatory strategy?
That would have been super interesting. The short answer and the long answer is no. I did, there is a clinical trial that has been set up. I'm not sure if it is closed yet. And yeah, unfortunately I have nothing more to add in that regard. But I'm gonna think about it.